Hello and welcome to this, our fourth webinar from Woodsvale Data, where we'll be looking at the impact of COVID-19 on individual giving. And in this webinar today, we'll be looking at the full year effect of the pandemic. This year, we've had to adapt the way we work as a sector, and we're really becoming universally agile and innovative in the way that we operate with our fundraising. And this is something that DEC and MSF are adept at, as they have to react quickly to changing circumstances with their fundraising all the time. And that's why we're so pleased to have them with us today to talk about the topic of Always Ready. Thank you to everyone for joining today. We have over 260 registrations from over 100 charity organisations, so we're thrilled to have you with us today. I'm Helen Hallahan, Head of Marketing at Woodsvale Data and your host for the next hour or so. We've got special thanks to our panellists for volunteering their time to share their experiences with you today. We've got Helen Daw, who is Head of Data Strategy and Insight at Woodsvale Data. She joins us to talk through her latest insight report, which is currently available on our website. So if you go to our website homepage, there'll be a button on a banner on the homepage that you can click and download the report. We've got James Kliffen, from Head of Fundraising at Médecins Sans Frontières UK, and he's going to talk about his integrated approach to individual giving fundraising. And we've got Simon Beresford, Director of Fundraising and Marketing at Disaster Emergency Committee, or DEC, to tell his COVID-19 story. This will be our last webinar in the impact of COVID-19 on individual giving, and we hope it will provide you with useful insights into how individual giving has performed over the last 12 months, as well as being able to hear stories from leading UK fundraisers. Just to let you know, we are also running a webinar on the 28th of April, which will focus on prize-led fundraising. So if you or anyone in your organisation works on raffles or weekly lotteries, and you're thinking, or even you're thinking about running a raffle or a weekly lottery, this will be a really great session for you to attend. There's a QR code on the screen at the moment that hopefully you can flash your phone up to, and it will take you through to the registration page. Otherwise, I'll pop that back up on the screen at the end of the webinar. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping as we go through. Emma Corbett is here. You might see her name in the list of panelists. She's here helping us make sure everything runs really smoothly as we go through the webinar today. Emma is our Sales Director at Woodsvale Data. So if you have any questions or queries about the kinds of work that we do at Woodsvale Data, other than the insight work that Helen is presenting today, then please do get in touch with Emma. And that is her email address. There is also a chat function on the bottom of your screen. You should have a bar that looks something like this. The bar will say chat. You're welcome to use the chat to talk to the other participants today. There's also a Q&A function. At the end of the webinar today, we'll be having a Q&A with the panelists. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have for Helen, James, or Simon throughout the session. And we'll also be running a series of polls after each of the presentations to involve you in the session today and to gain a wider kind of opinion base on a few key questions. Okay, so without further ado, I want to introduce you to Helen Dorr. Helen Dorr is our Head of Data Strategy and Insights at Woodsvale Data. She works closely with our charity partners and account directors, and her role is really to support their fundraising activities through data strategy and insights. She delivers actionable insights and recommendations along with wider charity benchmarking and trends analysis. She brings with her experience of working with the charity fundraising sector and working on data and CRM planning and insights projects. Helen's compiled the report that her presentation is based on, and as I say, it's available on our website. So don't forget, if you've got any questions for Helen, please use the Q&A button on your panel. Otherwise, over to you, Helen.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. Let me just share my screen. That presentation. There we go. Yes, good morning, everybody. So here we are again. Who'd have thought 1 year on? We'd still be sat here thinking about how this has impacted us and impacted our fundraising, but here we are, what a year. So just to set the scene a little bit, we are still in an ever-changing landscape. the demand for our services still remains really high, and the challenge for all of our fundraisers out there is still very, very high to meet the funding that it needs to raise. So what can we learn about individual giving in the UK off the back of that? An update this time around, 1 year on, and how can we understand that and use that to help you guys ensure that you are planning, and more importantly as well, the focus of today, always ready to adapt, innovate and respond. What can we take with us? I'm going to start off same format as normal, so I'm going to start with the cash campaigns. We can see now that we've got our sort of quarterly updates in there, and our fourth column is now complete. So looking at Feb last year through to the end of Jan this year. We can see overall against forecast, that's all of our campaigns, cash campaigns against forecast, we've ended up at a really steady and strong 21% uplift. Looking at the two rows below on the 15% and the 9% uplift, these are our response and average gift uplifts this year compared to the year before. So seeing the differences on our typical BAU campaigns, what's happened in the last year. And yeah, as we can see, the 15% uplift on response and 9% uplift on the average gift. Starting to hone in on that a little bit and understand the numbers behind those overall uplifts. So this is our cash individual giving, our BAU year on year. You can see last year, Feb 19 to Jan 20, we had a 10.8% average response rate. This year, Feb 20 to Jan 21, that's risen to 12.4%. So that 15% uplift generated by a 1.6 percentage point uplift. On the average gift, our average the year before was at £20.84, and we're now seeing an average of £22.68. So again, an uplift there of £1.84. I know as the year's gone by, I've been expecting at any given moment really kind of donor fatigue to kick in, especially after the end of the summer where things really got a bit harder for everybody. Redundancies were really kicking in, furlough was going on and on. The winter was coming and we went back into lockdowns again, with schools shutting, and then Christmas really took a bit of a blow really with the new variants coming into the country. And I think off the back of that, particularly at Christmas, I did think that things would start to drop off, but it's just not happened. And it's such a wonderful thing to see that our donors and the people out there are aware of charities and how important they are and want to help. And it's so positive to see that still coming through in our results 1 year on. Just to have a look at that Christmas period that I've just talked about. So you can see here, we're now looking at just November to Jan, the year before, and now this year. And you can see the average response rate we had in that Christmas period last year was 15.76%. This year gone up to 17.39%, so a 10.34% uplift there. And on the cash individual giving average gifts as well, you can see that we went from 21.83 to 22.84 over the Christmas periods year on year. The other interesting thing to just note here, although we're comparing like-for-like campaigns, we have seen over the last Christmas period just a slight widening of the data, of warm data that's included. I think as people and the charities that we work with are starting to realise that there's a giving spirit out there, and that it's going on, they are looking to generate more income from these areas that are still working for them. So that uplift in response rate is actually even kind of more positive really, in the grounds that it's having a slightly sort of wider warm data selection within it, perhaps utilising a bit more lapsed or kind of reactivating some people. Ooh, sorry about that. Going into quarter comparisons. So the one thing we can do this time that we haven't done before is just have a look at how things have varied quarter on quarter in the last year. So these are just a static view of 1 year from the Feb through to the January 21. But it's quite interesting just to see sort of typical response rates that we've had quarter by quarter and the average gifts too. Key thing to note here is obviously Christmas. It's always a good time of year for response, but you can see there, again, this is, it's happened again as normal, with a 22% uplift on the quarter before. The average gift is slightly more varied, so strong at Christmas, but actually its highest point was in the May, July. We had a lower response rate that quarter overall, which is very typical. You know, summer's not always a peak time of year for response rate, but the average gift was really high. So I think those that were giving at that time were potentially reacting, you know, very strongly to the needs around them, and those that, you know, could give and wanted to give at that point were giving very, very highly. Our balance of postal and online, a lot of our responses are postal, as you know, and we've, you know, touched on that before. So the numbers that we have to look at here for online response are quite small, the campaigns that we work on. But quite interestingly, we saw by the end of this annual period a 60% uplift overall in online on the year before. In the previous quarters, it's been a bit higher. We were up at 71% last time. So I think potentially with the Christmas campaigns, it might be a bit of a peak time of year for maybe some of our more traditional direct mail responsive givers to give. So potentially that's maybe where that shift has come from. However, as I said, numbers are still quite small for us in this arena. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. Just having a quick look at our charity types. So across 1 year compared to last year, we can see that, as we've seen all the way through, our health charities are getting a very high response rate compared to previous. Human services likewise. Animal and international, as we know, have taken a bit of a dip this year compared to previous. I think probably where some people in response to the pandemic have kind of focused in on health a bit more and the needs in society. The average gift as well, though, is just up across the board. If we look again at the kind of Christmas period year on year, just to hone in on that a little bit, you can see the response rates here. And then, and quite interestingly, actually, although human services has been up across the year, along with health, when it comes to the Christmas period, you can see a bit of a rebalancing happening. So the human services types of charities have seen a bit of a dip down compared to last year. Health is still up, but animal and international, where they were taking a much more of a response hit in earlier quarters, that's come back up. So kind of rebalancing a little bit there, I think. Average gift, as I say, is just up across the board. So, but you can see as international, typically we get some really, really high response rates there. Average gift, sorry. Emergency appeals. So we didn't have any in our last quarterly report. We saw obviously a flurry when the pandemic first hit, as our charities needed to find ways to generate some income where other fundraising channels have been shut to them, and they performed really brilliantly, way above forecast. We've seen a few happen over the Christmas period where charities again have needed to try and help generate some more funds to keep their charities moving forward, and we can see here a similar response to what we had last time, in that things have performed better than everyone thought, and they've performed very well. The forecast, and I guess it's worth probably knowing and thinking about the fact that actually people kind of know how an emergency appeal might perform now. So the forecast ended up being at a 3.53% overall. This is across quite sort of wide disparate bases. Actually came in at 3.92, so higher than even, I guess, a more informed forecasting. And the average gift, we had a sort of generic £30 forecast there, but came in way above that at £52.22. So those that were giving really well. Just moving on to our regular giving update. So as you've seen previously, regular giving has remained strong throughout 2020. Looking at the percentage of our base that's cancelled this year compared to last, you can see that 52% down on the year before. And here we can see it broken down by month. So we know there was that sort of knee-jerk reaction in March as the world changed around us, but it's been pretty steady since then, around the 1%. Interestingly, we do always tend to see a drop in cancellations in the run up to Christmas, and then quite often quite a big peak in January. New Year, I guess, resolutions, people thinking about tidying up their finances, or maybe they've done something in the run up to Christmas and slightly felt that they can't afford it ongoing. But this hasn't really happened this year. It's it's obviously gone up a little bit from the December dip, but really just back to where it was at the rest of the year. So we haven't seen that sort of panic or knee-jerk that we sometimes see in January. And I think that's, I guess, is that the people that are giving are really quite aware of how important that is for charities at the moment, and they want to help. So that kind of, sometimes that kickback cancellation that we see in January just isn't happening. Taking a little look at cancellations against acquisition, we know a lot of that drop in cancellations year on year will be because acquisition hasn't been taking place at the same levels as previous, and that's something that we know. The key things here to think about, so we can see the peak in cancellations that went up in March, and then really it's sort of largely followed acquisition. So acquisition dropped down into April as face-to-face channels in particular were shut, and the cancellations therefore dropped down following on from it. In the summer, we saw a bit of a rise again in acquisition, and the cancellation kind of follow on and come up a little bit off the back of it. But it's really interesting to see the last quarter. We've got a rise in new people coming on board, and considering that face-to-face is still not an option really, that's obviously coming from other channels, which is really, really positive to see that where our charities have had to think what else they can do to bring regular giving new people on board. These things are obviously starting to really take place and happen as part of an ongoing programme. And cancellation, similarly, although it is following the line, you can see it's much lower than it has been previously. So it makes me wonder whether actually the attrition on some of the alternative channels may be coming in at a lower rate than maybe some of the other acquisition channels that we would traditionally use for regular giving, face-to-face being a key one of those. So interesting changes starting to come through there, which will be interesting to track over time. Okay, just to summarise that for everybody. So on our always ready theme, and a year having gone through, what can we take forward with us? So it remains really clear. People want to help, they will give if they're asked. So that's something that we can really understand and keep doing. Channel availability is still difficult and probably will be for a little while yet, particularly with face-to-face and shops and events being impacted by the social controls around us. We've had to diversify, and channel innovation has been one of those things, but it appears to be working, and it appears to be keeping our income coming in alongside our more traditional methods, which are obviously still performing really well. There's been an increased focus on retention by charities this year. We've had lots and lots of conversations over the last few months around reviews of thanking programs and starting to think about where supporters are coming from, and particularly with diversification into different channels. Are these people that are coming in on different channels different? Do we need to talk to them in a different way, communicate with them in a different channel? So there's been lots of discussions around that, and how that fits into engaging with our supporters and thanking them for what they've been doing. I imagine as well that will carry on into next year, and there'll be more around that. And then finally, the agility and readiness to change in the charity community has delivered returns. So we've all had to adapt and change and do things a bit differently to try and keep the money coming in for our charities. And it appears to be working alongside some of the traditional methods that we know are reliable and work really well. There we go. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand back to Helen. Any questions at all, put them in the Q&A and I can pick those up at the end for you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. That's really interesting. Really interesting to see the uplifts on the total year effect as well as for just for the Christmas kind of campaign results through November, December and January. As Helen said, if you've got any questions, please pop them through. There's some already on the chat, so that's fantastic. We'll cover those off at the end, if that's all right. We're going to do a quick poll now. So I'm going to start a poll, and that should come up on your screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. And please vote on this. So the question is, which channel has delivered the most individual giving fundraising income in 2020 for your charity? Is that direct mail, DRTV, email, face-to-face, individual supporter initiatives, social media, telemarketing, people going direct to your website or something else entirely. So I'll just give you a minute or so to have a think about how that applies to your charity, and we'll share the results with everybody at the end. Okay, so we've got the results coming in now. Just a couple more seconds for anyone that's still thinking about that. Which channel has delivered the most individual giving fundraising income in 2020 for your charity? Is it direct mail, DRTV, email, face-to-face, individual supporter initiatives, social media, telemarketing, direct to your website, or something else? I'm going to end the polling now. Let's see what the results are. Okay, so unsurprisingly, direct mail has delivered the most individual giving fundraising income for 63% of the people who participated in the poll today. Interestingly, coming up kind of directly behind there is social media at 9%, much lower, but also direct to website. So that's quite interesting, people going unsolicited directly to your website to donate, which I guess when people are feeling in these times that they need to contribute and to give, to help, that's something that has been happening. Okay, so thank you everyone for doing that poll. There'll be another one after we've heard from James. So we're really thrilled to have James here with us today. James is the head of fundraising at Médecins Sans Frontières, and I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong. He's helped launch fundraising for MSF in India, South Africa, and Ireland as well. James was previously coordinated appeals by the Disasters Emergency Committee and the British Red Cross, and he is a trustee of music support. So thank you very much, James. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Helen, and good morning. Maybe I'm going to start by saying that the charity that I work for, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, I'll call us MSF from now on, we're in the 7%, which is direct website, but it's not unsolicited. And I'm going to talk really to that point. But before I do, just an additional bit of background about myself. For 7 years, I was part of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, Technology and Digital Group, and finished my time there as chair. And in that group, we really tried to share knowledge, intelligence, ideas, experiences, and advice with charities of all sizes and types across the UK charity sector, and very much not just the large few ones like the one I work for. And it's something that is a major concern of ours in our work. And to that point, if you're in one of those charities, and perhaps you haven't had the amazing results that Helen's been talking about, then I share your experience, because I'm a trustee of a charity called Music Support. Helen just mentioned it. Music Support, we help people in the music industry with problems of mental health and addiction. This is very much the vast industry of people who are not on the stage, that are hidden from you when you go to a concert or festival. And you probably heard something in the news over recent months about how hard they've been hit, because so many of them, their employment, the way they've been employed means that they don't qualify for furlough scheme, and they simply don't have income coming in. So Music Support, our income at the beginning of this year was very much corporate from people in the music industry. Not easy to win. Don't get the idea that it's a rich charity at all. Reserves quite low, and overnight, like that, live music stopped, and with that, really the income just stopped, and we faced going under almost instantly. And I'm not saying that lightly. It was very, very difficult. But at the same time, we knew that the needs that Music Support was there to help with were only going to increase. And we just launched a digital app, which was perfect for that moment of people being isolated. Thrive app, NHS approved, to provide mental health support for people in the industry. And at that moment, I referred back to something from 20 years ago, which was 20 years ago, I saw a piece of research presented on what happened for US charities after 9/11, where many of them, their income fell because people gave to the 9/11 causes. Those charities that did two things, that concentrated on their core cause, the reason why people supported them at the essence, and also referenced the disaster that just happened, they did very well. others didn't do as well. So for music support, that's exactly what we did, was we concentrated on that core cause, and very much referenced what was happening to the industry, because that was obvious. And I'm glad to say that we just had a board meeting yesterday, and we're now looking forward to a plan of expansion going into the year. And that's been hard fought for every single pound of money. But just to say, I know what that feels like. For MSF, they talk briefly about our fundraising. What I would like to say is I don't have slides today, but there is going to be a resource that I'm going to mention at the end of the talk, which is going to be sent to you, which gives you a whole bunch of details if that's what you want. And it's a video which has been well received by charities that are very much not of the type I work for, international. For MSF, the funds that we raise are private, full stop, no government funding in the UK, and pretty much everywhere in the world. We don't take EU funding, we don't take US government funding. What that means is that for our fundraising, our return on investment from fundraising has to be much higher, because we don't have the government funding to pay for our work in the countries we work in, like Yemen, Syria, and South Sudan. So for every pound we spend on fundraising in the UK, last year we raised £8. That's double or more what you'd find in a similar charity. Now, you might think, well, that's great, they just do some things. Well, it's not that easy, because we use exactly the same methods as everybody else does. What does that mean in practice? Well, I started fundraising for Médecins Sans Frontières back in 1996, which seems like a lifetime ago, 25 years ago, a team of one, just myself in an office of 4 people. And it was very clear, producing a business plan at the beginning, that the only way we're going to deliver that return on investment was by having very strong loyalty and very strong lifetime value. So Helen's just mentioned that that's been a focus. Retention has been a focus in the last year. For us, it's been a focus for the last 25 years. And it's been a key driver in everything that we do, over immediate return. And so, and that very much includes regular giving. Now, we started that approach, and it carried on for a period of years and was very successful. And at a certain moment, roughly about 2005, we then had a massive disruption very early from digital. What was happening is our supporters were giving on our website, but they were giving in a way that we couldn't attribute it to the other things we were doing, DRTV, direct mail, and the model started to break down because we couldn't measure our results. I could talk at length about that, but it was a very, very real problem. It's not as straightforward as saying, oh yes, it's free money coming into the website, because it was very clear that our TV campaigns, our insert campaigns, direct mail campaigns were driving that response. I mean, later on, you would know that in your own life as the phenomenon of second screening, you know, where you're watching TV and you've got your laptop, you've got your tablet or phone by you and you do something. We also then, a bit later on, had a further massive disruption caused by regulation and legislation of fundraising. There were certain things that we did that we could no longer do. So SMS conversion of DRT for DRTV stopped for us. It was a choice we made because it just didn't fit with the direction of travel that fundraising was going in. How do we solve that problem? We solve that problem through integration of all the channels. And by all the channels, I don't just mean direct marketing, I mean every channel. So that means our communications in the media. It means our fundraising channels. It includes actually in it major donor fundraising, and it very much includes digital. So what does that mean in practice? Well, what it means in practice, for example, is that any fundraising campaign we produce, like a TV campaign, has to work for every type of donor, which means that it needs to work for the billionaire philanthropist, and it needs to work for my mum, who's a monthly donor to MSF. It needs to work for everybody. And that means a very tight, coherent fit between these different channels. So how do we do that? Well, 2 things. One of which is that when we plan our fundraising, we actually do it together with our communications colleagues, with our digital colleagues in one room. And we work with a consultant called Bob, who helps us do that. He's not a fundraising consultant. And that's how we basically do our planning. And in these workshops, it might surprise you that the only person who's not allowed to contribute ideas is me. The idea is a bottom-up, diverse approach to innovation. And the single point of integration that we have in our fundraising, communications, and digital is a French word, témoignage. That means to bear witness. What does that mean? It means doctors and nurses and logisticians telling their story to the camera in direct mail, but you also hear them on the Today program. These are people that you can relate to, they're peers, but they also provide, through their testimony, a bridge between the places that they're in and the places where we are. So that could be in an Ebola outbreak, that could be in the front line in Yemen. And that's how we do it. Now, if you bring us up to 2020 and more recently, we then had a further evolution of that, which is that Lee, who heads up our digital team, Lee Butler, attended some training by Google on their sprint methodology. And Lee brought that methodology of creating to us, and basically took our comms, digital and fundraising team into a room, ran a version of that, which he'd adapted because they do it in a week. There was no way we were going to give a week to it, so we did it in a day. And we've used that to create our integrated campaigns. And we've done that now for a couple of years, to the point where when COVID-19 happened and when lockdown was about to happen, 3 of my colleagues, 2 of them in the communications team and 1 in the fundraising team, had the idea of going to the house of our international president, who's a working doctor, who's working in the NHS. That's why his home was in the UK, to go to his house and in his home record a DRTV campaign with help from our agency. But the key point about this methodology that we use, the Google Sprint methodology, is that we create the core concepts in a creative competition, which very much involves also the agencies we work with. So we're all in one room, 4 teams, come up with ideas, and that's what we create. And that means that we own that and we create it. And that's exactly what happened, a version of it, but virtually, just after we went into lockdown, we shot that video and then created all the different channels that we used. And the team followed their roles that they would normally follow when we were in the office. And they were able to do that and scale up hugely. For example, a door drop campaign was created and delivered in 1 week. Now, that all sounds very exciting if you're a kind of career fundraiser like me, but there is a but coming, which is that that's really great, but you need to make sure that also in terms of your setup for the data, for the fulfillment, the thanking, that's also managed in a precise and careful way, because we were going full tilt at this, but you don't want to end up at a problem with thanking inappropriately or donations not being fulfilled. And obviously we work with Woods Well data, that's why I'm on this call. That was very much part of the process that we created. And if I'm going to push a point as much as I can in this talk, is that the hidden secret to our fundraising success, because we have been very successful this year, has been something called the Think Stewardship Tracker. I'm not trying to sell Think services, but what that does is it's a panel who mystery shop the service that you provide to supporters in lots of different ways. Their experience of making donations, making complaints, asking for information, very comprehensive, very detailed. And we've been in it since 2014. And since 2014, for overall performance, we've been ranked first. And we were in 2020 through the period of COVID, because all of that necessary behind the scenes work was done, which includes sending inspirational thank you letters and emails to people. It means that when they phone up a call center, the team there are highly motivated, with the end result being loyalty and lifetime value. Now, the integrated campaigns that I just mentioned for COVID this year, the one we and the one we had at Christmas last year, have this year won 11 UK and international marketing awards, the commercial awards, up against people like Sony and MasterCard in America. Now, awards don't raise money, but it's interesting that in this model of integrated fundraising that we basically built up and own ourselves, we've created ourselves at no cost. We seem to have arrived at the formula, which basically seems to be something which is also kind of state of the art in the commercial sector. Do we know all the answers? No, we don't. Are we experts? No, we're not. But we seem to have succeeded. And a key part of that is that the expert agencies we work with, our digital marketing agency, our direct marketing media agency, the creative agencies we work with, are all part of a team of experts that work together. Now, I mentioned a resource at the beginning. So Lee, who's the head of our digital team, recently gave a talk for the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, Technology and Digital Group, which over 300 people attended. He had 40 questions afterwards, and there's a really great video of it. And you're going to be sent a video afterwards, which gives you an hour-long briefing on how we approach integrated fundraising and how we've achieved the success we have this year. We've increased our private income by 20%. We've increased our income from individual donations by over 100% this year. And obviously that's got a lot to do with COVID-19 and the relevance of our cause to COVID-19. And that hugely drives that. But I hope that the methodology that we're using, which as I keep mentioning is free, and which you're going to get a video about how we do it, is of interest to you. So thank you very much. Thank you.
It's fantastic, James. Thank you very much. And I think it's really interesting how the approach that you have to your campaigns, getting all of your agencies together in one place, all of those experts have produced such incredible results, as you say, recognised, won awards against those larger multinational organisations. Fantastic credit, and hopefully it's something that some of the other charities who are attending today might be able to try in their own organisations to see how they can make that work as well, bringing everybody together and using that collective knowledge all in one room at one time. And it really helps you become more agile in the way that you're working and be able to respond to those situations. Fantastic. If you've got any questions for James, please ask them in the Q&A, and we will look to answer those at the end. Just jumping on a quick poll right now. I will open that. Okay, so this is a really quick one, and that is, do you feel more prepared now as a team for situations like COVID-19, if they were to happen in the future, something very similar to this? Is it something that as a community, as a fundraising community, or as a team within your charity, you feel that we're much better placed to adapt to right now? So really simple, yes or no answer to that. I'll just give you a few more seconds to answer. Okay. I think we've pretty much got everybody in. So do you feel more prepared now as a team for situations like this in the future? Yes or no? Or is it still something that it feels very much a black art? Okay, so I'll stop polling there and share the results. So fantastic in terms of the results that we've got here. We've got 94% of the people that responded who are attending today said, yes, we feel more prepared as a team for situations like this, feel more able to enter into these kind of situations in the future. So that is fantastic, and hopefully some of the stories from James and Simon today will help us all be that little bit more prepared as well as we go forward. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Simon Beresford, who is the Director of Fundraising and Marketing from the Disasters Emergency Committee. Simon leads the fundraising and marketing department at the DEC. He's responsible for all fundraising, including high value partnerships, individual giving, online and offline marketing, and supporter care. He coordinates the DEC Fundraising Directors Group, bringing together the senior fundraising and public engagement leaders from across their member charities to collaborate on maximising DEC appeals for disaster-affected communities. Outside of his international focused work with the DEC, Simon remains a committed advocate for improving children and young people's services in the UK. Over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And before we get into anything else, colleagues across the sector, I hope you're all doing okay in the midst of everything at the moment. Certainly still feels like it's stressful in different ways at all times, and I know you'll all be dealing with different things. So yeah, just before anything else, I hope everyone's all right. Speaking to the kind of space of being ready to respond. Obviously the DEC, for those of you who don't know, we launch only emergency appeals, so we don't do any revenue fundraising at all. Our members contribute to our core costs. So I'm not out there doing revenue campaigns, I'm launching emergency appeals. And what that means is that we've got to always be ready for a changing external environment where we might have to suddenly respond at very short notice to something happening in the world, which has sort of stood us in good stead in a lot of ways for what's happened over the last year, but has also, just like everybody, challenged those systems and things. So what I thought, especially hearing earlier on from Helen, that emergency appeals, people are starting to see them again. Obviously, emergency appeals are what we can really speak to. So slightly different tack on this one to think. maybe help you think through some of the processes and procedures that have really served us well in launching emergency appeals. And if you're considering emergency appeals, obviously within your space, not the international space, although maybe for some of you, maybe some of the things that I would suggest thinking about for building that in as an ongoing thing that you consider, as opposed to just something you did as a one-off. So who are we? Just to very briefly talk about who we are to give the context. So I work for the Secretariat team, which runs the DEC Central Appeals. But around us, we have all of our member agencies. So we have 14 member agencies and a series of independent trustees as well. All of our board are the CEOs of our members. Then we have a series of independents, including the chair. And then we have something called the Rapid Response Network, which I'll describe in a second as well. Just in case any of you are from them, first of all, but also if you're curious, these are our 14 member agencies. And the thing to highlight there really is that includes some of the largest charities in the international sector, such as Save the Children, Oxfam, Red Cross, but also some more specific organisations, more niche organisations like Action Against Hunger or Age International. So quite a spread of agencies that we work with, and it's a joint campaign that we launch whenever we do launch a DEC appeal. And then the Rapid Response Network is everyone else we try and bring with us when we launch an appeal. And really, I would draw your attention to the logos at the top there, because that's really who we leverage on behalf of the sector. We are in this kind of nexus between the media industry and the charitable industry in terms of launching emergency appeals, because we have formal agreements with the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5 and Sky, through Radio Centre, all the commercial radio groups as well. And so when we launch an appeal, we're still the only thing in the country that is played out across all national media through formal partnerships on the same day, all the TV stations. If you think of all the other TV partnerships, they are sort of channel by channel agreements with a thing that plays out across all of them. And the only reason I describe all of that is not that I think that's all particularly relevant for you, although what it is to say is that we have a lot of stakeholders that we need to bring with us. And we know that when we launch an appeal, bringing our stakeholders with us does equal bigger and better results for our appeals. And so that's some of the context for you to think through actually who your most valuable stakeholders would be in bringing along those journeys, so that by the time you're launching an emergency appeal, there's actually a really fine-tuned way of doing that that's going to maximize results. So how do we decide when we're going to do this, and how are you going to decide when you're going to launch an appeal? Maybe it was quite obvious at the beginning of this crisis, but maybe if you think about, when is an emergency appeal appropriate for us if this is part of our future? Well, we judge it on these three criteria broadly. There's a lot that sits underneath that, but it's the scale of the program's need that we'd be responding to. It's the ability of our member agencies, in your instance, the ability of your programming to be able to meet that need that we're able to identify that's suddenly very different because of something that's happened externally. And then do you feel that your audiences, do you have evidence to suggest that your audiences are going to be strongly sympathetic to this particular crisis, to this particular cause? Do they have an awareness and sympathy for it? And it's the three of those things together that for us would necessitate putting the case formally together for an emergency appeal. So what would that mean in your context? And really the thought I thought I'd share with you is, do you have a clear set of agreed criteria for when you will, and very importantly, when you won't, mobilize and reprioritize, because you're going to have other things on at the same time, based on something that's rapidly changed externally. So if you want to take this very agile approach to suddenly launching something new, do you have internal agreement about when you will consider that, and equally when you won't? There are lots of situations where the DEC doesn't launch an appeal, and it's just as important that we have the right processes and criteria to say when we won't do something as when we will. And agreeing some of those criteria in advance can really help you by the time you come to those situations, which will always still have nuance, to have a sort of platform to build those decision-making processes on. And then how can you bring stakeholders with you? I've mentioned some of ours, so all of our members, and through our own board and getting them on board in terms of making that decision that we've met these criteria that we've agreed. But then also we formally go to our broadcast partners with a case for appeal every time and say, we want you to come on board with us. We're asking you to agree that this is one of these situations that warrants a DEC appeal. So what does that look like in your context? Do you have a robust and agreed decision-making process? that's going to bring your stakeholders with you. I can think of smaller agencies that I've worked for in the past where I can think of who those stakeholders would have been, and we didn't necessarily always have those stakeholders in our minds when we were making the decision. We were making the decision for the charity, but we weren't thinking necessarily in the decision-making process itself about how we were going to bring those stakeholders with us. It was kind of good. That was going to be stage two. My time at the DEC has very much taught me that actually integrating those into your decision-making process can be really powerful to then delivering a more successful appeal on the back of it. And just a final point at the bottom there is don't skip risk assessment. Sometimes something big can happen in the world, something big, like coronavirus, like the changing situation that we're all facing still at the moment, a sudden change for the organization, etc. Sometimes it's very easy to jump straight on, trying to take a more agile approach, jumping straight onto an opportunity without necessarily fully risk assessing it. Now, I'm talking about rapid risk assessment, but I think if you can build a risk assessment process that is rapid, it does still help you to think through where the pitfalls might be. And again, thinking through previous organizations I've worked for, we haven't always had those processes in place before just diving ahead with an idea, but it really does help. And even when you're trying to do things rapidly, making sure that there's a risk assessment step can help you to mitigate some of the pitfalls that might come. I'm not going to necessarily get into our, so that PJA is a period of joint action. So this is 14 days, there's a very agreed set of ways of working between our members, ourselves, and some of our other stakeholders in terms of how we launch an appeal. I'm not necessarily going to get into all of how it works. This was drawn from another slideshow. But what I would say is, have you got that agreement in place? If you want to be able to work rapidly, if you want to be able to work across all these different stakeholders, if you want to be able to move quickly and agilely, especially in this new context that we're all still in and will continue to be in as lockdown releases and etc. Our stakeholders agreed, both internal and external, on how you're going to work together if you decide to do something rapidly together, whether that's an emergency or a peer, or indeed something else, trying new innovations, etc. If there are agreed ways of working, has it been mapped? Do you have dependencies that you've thought through in advance? Because essentially, a lot of what I want to leave you with is this thought, which is really pre-planning and structures can really enable agility to take place. This thing that you're seeing on the right-hand side here is a sort of list of the types of things that we prepare when we're launching an appeal. So just to pick, and this is all sort of shared digitally across all our stakeholders so that everyone has access to the same things at the same time for when we're ready to go on something. But I'll just take one example of this, which is on the right there, the key messages document. So the key messages document is really important for keeping everyone on page, and that's everyone from our creatives and our agencies, all the way through to our internal stakeholders and our staff who might be writing copy or doing different things depending on the areas and the channels that they're managing. We have a really strict and tight procedure for how key messages get agreed internally. It starts with programs, it goes through communications, and then it hits fundraising. And the reason that really works for us is that all the fact checking and all the really careful nuance of language happens before it's reached the fundraising team, to make sure that by the time it reaches the fundraising team, we've got more delegated authority to be able to take that language and use it without it having to go through lots of layers of sign off again before it reaches public consumption. And all of that enables that rapidity, that speed of response, that speed of being able to get these things out across different channels and keep it cohesive to as much of a degree as we can. So again, what are the equivalents for your organizations? How can you make sure that to enable people to do things very quickly in an emergency or in a very rapidly changing external environment, have you got the right thinking in place ahead of time, the right systems in place ahead of time to make sure that you can minimize sign-off, you can minimize how many layers of sign-off things need to go through, and how much delegated authority, including on budgets, people can have. We pre-agree sort of templated budgets for different areas of work. And all of that helps so that people have the messages and they've got the budgets agreed that they can make their own decisions, obviously with a certain level of sign-off still, but much quicker than in many previous organizations that I've worked for, including much smaller charities that I think this absolutely would have applied for if we brought in the same kind of thinking. So, think about your systems and structures in quiet time. I know there's no such thing as quiet time, but how can you stress test these systems, think through dependencies, think through how you'd work through things in a way that it enables, if you have to move quickly on something, it enables you to do that as fast and as quickly as possible. And can you stress test it? Can you run mock scenarios? Can you do crisis comms planning? What if all that went wrong and you sent out the wrong message? Do you have a crisis comms plan in place, and do people know what they would need to do? And I realized that this might seem a bit like overkill for some organizations in terms of the number of people you might have working on something, but maybe just think through these territories of things. Do you have the right procedures in place, a critical path for how you deliver something quickly, and do the few people who would need to work on it know exactly what they'd need to do? The more you can do that thinking in advance, the better you're then able to deal with the nuance building on that platform when you need to move quickly later. And just a final thought, really, include that readiness around being able to move quickly. As new people come on board, inductions, regular top-up training, you might not always need to move quickly on these kind of appeals because you're doing lots of revenue generating stuff all of the time. But making sure that you've built in all that work that you've put into preparing it for when you do, into making sure that people are on board with that on a semi-regular basis so they know what they would be doing, can be really, again, important. And I'm very conscious of time, but I'll just leave you with a few thoughts from the sort of coronavirus appeal and some of our experiences in case you're still thinking about how you're navigating this in your comms. So first of all, our experience would be that this is a very complex subject for audiences. And this, again, is about that risk assessment point that I was making earlier on. There are lots of ideas floating around, including right now in the international sector, about the sorts of things we should be communicating with the public around, for instance, around vaccines right now, and the opportunities that this might create in the marketplace. Just because something is a possible idea and you can move on it quickly doesn't mean it's the right idea or appropriate. And so, I would encourage you to continue listening and testing messages with audiences before taking things out, particularly related to coronavirus, because people are very overwhelmed out there around coronavirus. There's also some elements of fatigue, but actually it's been quite politicized in all sorts of different ways, as we're all very aware, but that has resonated with audiences. So we do need to be careful about how we're framing around coronavirus at the moment. And obviously our whole appeal is around coronavirus, so that means we're having to be careful in all sorts of ways. It's creating, I've sort of mentioned this now, but it's creating both opportunities and challenges. And so definitely, if you've got the capacity to be able to set up insight platforms, panels, the sorts of things that James was talking about before, where he's able to engage with audiences, this is really valuable insight in rapidly changing external environments. Media narratives continue to matter deeply. What is being said on the news is impacting people and what they're thinking, but audiences are moving on very quickly as well. There is a big difference between what is front of mind at any one time. The sort of insight we were doing a year, 18 months ago, the number one thing was the climate crisis at the time in supporters' concerns for the world. That's changed, but at the same time, some of the longer term perceptions that people are holding true and are actually not shifting particularly dramatically yet from the evidence we're seeing so far, but this will obviously continue to change. And then a final point, and it kind of relates to something that I've heard throughout the conversation today, is if you're thinking about continuing to frame around coronavirus and continuing to jump on things quickly, particularly for emergency appeals, my advice to you all would be, do not spin your programming or try and upweight the sense of urgency in your comms or your fundraising. If, when you really analyze it in the cold light of day and you were to look at it with sort of fresh eyes, you could say that we are doing that. We're spinning, we're trying to reframe it to make it work with what we think the external environment is. If it's not genuinely emergency programming, don't try and frame it as such, because even if you get a good return on investment, it will harm perception of both your brand, but it's also actually harmful to the wider charity sector, because donors do pick this up. If we're not entirely truthful, I'm not saying that anyone's lying, but I've certainly seen things that have been trying to force frame certain programming as a coronavirus response, or as an emergency response that is having to be because of coronavirus. If it's not that, please don't try and frame it as that, including for your emergency appeals, because that's not going to help anyone. And actually, this is where some of the challenges around trust do come in with fundraising communication. So I'm kind of ending on a slightly strange one there, but it's definitely something we're continuing to see in our insight that I thought would be worth sharing with you all. very happy to be in touch with any of you after this meeting. If any of that was helpful or prompts further questions, I know we're about to do some questions now. There's my email, and there's Twitter as well. I'm always happy for people to check on there as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was really interesting. I particularly enjoyed learning about how you worked with your stakeholders, making sure that they're all on board before an emergency even transpires, so that when you are when something does happen, you're ready to go from that first step. And the fact that it's all about planning and structures and having everything in place and ready. So that's a really interesting piece that I think people can take away from that, is about putting those plans in place so that we're ready to go when we need to. I think it would be great if we could start with the Q&A, and James and Helen, if you could come back online. But the first question, really, I think, Simon, if we could start with you, and this is a question from one of our attendees, anonymously asked, who were thinking about putting a second emergency appeal out. So just read that so I'm not looking at a different screen. So looking at your insight, how do you expect a second emergency appeal will go if a charity were to try and run a follow-up now? The person that asked the question has been explaining to their financial director that we can't do an emergency appeal every year, so any advice would help. And Simon, I just thought that may be aligned with what you were just saying at the end of your presentation there. Could you take that one for us?
Yeah, I mean, happy to. Look, people will see responses to emergency appeals. You will. Like emergency appeals, I think some of the reasons that in some of the insight I know has been coming out of, excellent insight that's been coming out of Woods Vale data, I think people were underestimating how much an emergency appeal was going to return, because a lot of organizations don't usually do it. But my challenge to that is what I was saying at the end, is that, you know, just because you can doesn't mean you should, and actually it can cause damage if it's misframed, or the emergency language, the emergency framing is used in a way which is actually a bit disingenuous, if we're honest. And there are instances out there where that is true. Obviously, the DEC is in a very privileged position when it comes to this, because that's our raison d'etre, and you know, we have all these criteria around things. So I would say, yes, you can absolutely do it. Yes, you will still see returns. But I would warn against framing out something as an emergency appeal if it's not really an emergency appeal. If you have a reason for it to be an emergency appeal, what James was saying earlier on around the music charity, sorry to speak for you, James, but, you know, excellent example, focused on the core of what that organization was doing and the need for that response in the short term. So if there is that driver, absolutely. But you know, I have seen and heard horror stories about charities who have these kind of emergency appeals once a year. I think that's disingenuous, personally, and I do think that the insight that we see from supporters, and I'm not just talking about DEC supporters, but just supporter insight and research more broadly, is that over time that does erode trust in what this means when we say to the public that something is an emergency, and the power of those words when we use that kind of lexicon, if that makes sense. So be careful with it. It's a precious thing to be able to use, but at the same time, if it's a real need and a real emergency, and your programming answers that emergency, then absolutely emergency appeals are something to continue to build the process in place for it and use.
Brilliant, thank you.
James,
Helen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, for me, the question I always ask myself is what will our supporters think? Is this relevant to them? And we you know, right now, for example, if I was thinking about an emergency appeal for COVID right now, I would be wondering whether that would be the right thing to do for the charity that I work for. And the reason for that is because operationally, actually, the needs that we're seeing are reducing. But also, if you look at the narrative arc about what's being said in the media in this country, it's going in the direction of decreasing urgency. I'm not trying to steer you away from doing anything, but it's those two things really. But in fact, the main thing is, will this work for your supporters? And if the answer is you feel that it wouldn't, then you have your answer. But there we are. Or if you think it's really going to work, go for it. So sorry.
Thank you. It's really great to have those two different viewpoints. Conscious of time and that we're nearly at 12 o'clock, there are some more questions come in. Would it be okay, Simon, James and Helen, if I sent those questions out and you pop me an answer through, and then I can send those through on an email to all the attendees? That would be great. Thank you. And thank you, all three of you, for volunteering your time today to talk to everyone that came along to the webinar today, and everyone that will be watching on demand. Really, really insightful and interesting information that's come through. Thank you. As I said, the webinar will be available on demand for everybody, probably as of Monday. I'll send the email out as aforementioned, and we'll get you a link to that. So if you know anyone else that would find this useful, that will also contain the link that James talked about from his colleague Lee, and the presentation that he gave earlier this week, I think. The webinar on the 28th of April, I'll send a link out to that as well. And if you've got any more questions, please feel free to get in touch with myself, with Helen, or with Emma Corbett at Woods Vale Data, and we'll see what we can do. I'm going to leave you with a quick poll with some feedback on there. If you would just take a couple of minutes to fill that out for us. Really grateful. That will help us for future events such as these. So thank you again very much, Simon, Helen and James, and have a very good rest of Friday and weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.
Helen, just quickly, can I say that if anybody wants to get in touch directly to ask about our experiences, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me, James Kliffen, MSF. Please get in touch. Somebody already has. So Brilliant. Just say we're really, really open to sharing everything that we know, if it's of help. So just say that.
It's very generous. Thank you very much.
And I'll jump on that as well. Absolutely, we're a collaborative body at our very core with all of our members. So very happy to hear and share anything we can be helpful with as well, as James said.
Brilliant. Just taking the feedback. So panelists, you're welcome to leave. I'm just going to stay on while the feedback comes in from everyone. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.